So I'm going to talk a little bit more and then Kyron will jump in again. So now we're just going to talk about the key data elements of the submission. All right, and so one of them is the District of Special Education Accountability. This is identified in your special education program file. Of course, it always identifies who's responsible for ensuring the student special education services provided. It's of particular importance because the DSEA, or the District of Special Education Accountability, is going to be reflected on the California School Dashboard. So regardless of who's the reporting LEA, that District of Special Education Accountability will show on the California School Dashboard. And as many of you know, there's so many different relationships between LEAs, county offices, SELPAs, as far as meeting our students with disabilities needs. There can be quite a juggle sometimes in identifying or establishing the District of Special Education Accountability. Another important field is the special education meeting type. And the meeting type's of particular importance because it identifies many things, in particular, which records should have services and what shouldn't. And we'll talk about that when we do services. But the different type of meetings are, 10, Part B, initial evaluation. Those are for IAEPs and ISPs. You have 15, which is Part C, initial evaluation. Those are for your IFSP. Then you have your 20, which is an annual meeting, 30, which is pending evaluation, and 40, which is triennial. Don't be so transfixed on the different names and titles. What you really want to understand with the meetings are the purpose of the meetings, and that's always described in the CalPEDS code set. So you can look up at each meeting code if there's ever a question of which meeting it should be. But generally speaking, triennials are evaluations. They don't have to come every 3 years, but at least once every 3 years. And they're used to determine a student's continuing eligibility for special education services. Your initials are the first meeting upon getting parental consent and a referral. And in those meetings, they can have services. You're establishing their IEP or the ISP or IFSP. And then 20, again, if you're making any changes throughout the year, it's most likely going to be an annual. Again, an annual doesn't have to be once a year. It can be multiple times if you're making changes or updates to services throughout the year. And then you have your education plan type. Those are the different types of special education programs. Again, infants and toddlers are going to be covered under the IFSP. The IEP is for public school students receiving special education services. The ISP is for those private school students. And the education plan type really impacts how students are enrolled. And I think this would be a good time real quickly, if you're ready, Kyron, to go back to 161. And so we could just show the table.
Okay.
Okay.
So you have flash 161 here.
If you scroll down within this flash, there's a quick table. Here it is. And it will tell you the plan type, and this is by grade level, but plan type is also corresponding to grade level. That's the table I want, Kyron. So your IFSP students are going to be the infants and toddlers, and you see them on the top row. And it tells you non-ADA, that's the 50 enrollment status, right? But where we get confused is a lot of times we want to use a 50 with our PS students. And this table will tell you that it's a PS, it's a primary enrollment, so it can't be not an ADA. You see that? It has to be a primary even though they're preschool. And with that, they would have an IEP. And so it's important to, and this is explained in the data guide as well, but this is a good reference because what we find is there's always a lot of discussion between the LEA data coordinator and the special education data coordinator. We're doing two distinct parts of reporting the students' information, and we both need to know the requirements. It's likely that your SEDS data coordinator doesn't understand the nuance of enrollment, but if you don't understand the nuances of grade level and plan type, you're always going to be struggling to enroll these students. And so these are the tables that you would go to, the quick references that you can get this information. Another good resource, and I'm not suggesting you go there, Kyron, but we'll go there later, is the CalPEDS FAQ. If you go to the Wednesday Q&A, Alex is really quick at going to the FAQ and doing a Control F. I don't want to do that now, but I just wanted to go back to Flash 161 and the data guide because they are older resources, but that information is still relevant and valid today, right? And so as you're enrolling the students, this is the resources that you want to have access on speed dial, so to speak. And you want to build your referential knowledge. I don't expect you to remember everything in the flashes. I certainly don't remember everything, but I can quickly know the importance and what general concept was introduced in the flash. So if you submit me a ticket, I can go to Flash 161 and find out the information. I don't necessarily know it offhand.
Yeah, and it's better to know the enrollments now rather than realize you had the enrollments wrong when you get all of those cert errors at the end of submission when you're in a rush to certify.
All right. And so moving on to the disability category code. This is the reason why the student is eligible for special education. Certainly there are more and various different type of disabilities and varying severity of impact of these disabilities. However, once a student is identified as eligible for special education, the primary disability will tell us or the federal government or the state why the student is eligible for special education. This is important because as they look at the services and the environment of the student, it can be weighed and measured if that student's in the best learning environment, right? And so there's 14 different categories. Of course, there's a primary and a second disability code. And if the student only has one disability, the expectation is the second disability code will just say none. I think they both would have to be populated. And then you have your special education program setting. This is that least restrictive environment. This is the setting in which the student is receiving the majority of their special education instruction. And it varies. The different settings could be a home setting, separate classroom setting, a separate school, a residential facility, a regular classroom, a public day classroom, right? There's so many different settings that the students can be in. And one particular buzzword, because there was a change this year, and it's already affected many of you, was school age setting, right? Students that are school age, and before this particular year, it was the understanding was students that were 6 and above were school age. And then clarification that came down from federal government that kindergarten was considered school age. So that's why there was a change in when a student turns 5 and they're in kindergarten, you have to indicate how much percentage of time they're in general education. And we'll talk about that next. But how would you know what is a school age setting, right? If you're getting an error because you picked the wrong setting for a student, how do you know what's a school age setting? And this will bring us an example of how to use a different tool, valid code combinations, because you're not going to find a school age setting in the code sets. They'll tell you each setting and it will define each setting, but it doesn't help you show the school age setting. So Kyron, if you will.
So if you don't know where to download the valid code combos document, at the footer of CalPads, this is your go-to for at least most of end of year 1 and end of year 4. Click on that, and it brings up this document here. So scroll far to your right and look for program plan versus program setting, or IP plan or setting. So Nate was hinting on the age. So depending on the plan and depending on the age too, because you should be able to know the setting, or at least these are the valid settings you can use to report in CalPads for when
Right.
those settings are needed. So
And
you have IEPs, which what starts at what age, Nate? And then
preschool.
IFSPs, yeah.
And so you have to know that your IFSP is not a school age setting, right? And so I don't know how many data coordinators would be going through this, but if your SEDS data coordinator is listening, or if you're assisting them, that's what they're looking for. They want a school age setting. I don't remember what submission validation it is, probably invalid setting for program type or age. So you would filter for just your IEP and your ISPs, right? The not eligible, the pending, you don't need, the IFSP, you don't need. You just want your ISP and your IEP. And once you have filtered everything else away, what remains are the valid school age settings. And so you would just want to make sure that you're reporting your student with the valid setting. And it's the majority of them, but that's kind of what it's looking at. And this is how you would reference the valid code combinations document. Anytime you get invalid error, right, that's usually meaning you have submitted a good value. It doesn't work in combination with another code. And if you look at the CalPADS error list, it would reference you to the valid code combinations document, which we're looking at. And here you can see what valid settings are. Of course, if the student was in a private school, they would be an ISP, and you would have those settings. And you can see some of them are duplicative, right? ISP can have a 201, an IEP can have a 201. And if they're in public school, they're going to be an IEP if they're school age receiving special education services. So it's just something that you need to be aware of, something that's caught a few people along the way. And more than anything else, it allows us to emphasize the importance of the different documents in addition to the error list and how you can use them. So thank you, Kyron. And with students turning 5, you also have to populate the general education participation range code in the SPED file. So again, student is enrolled at 4 years old, receiving services from infancy or being a toddler. If they turn 5 and they are in kindergarten, all of a sudden, you're going to have to populate the general education participation range code, right? And so there's 3 different categories. The codes are 1, 2, 3. That's why they're used here on the slide. And is the student in regular classroom environment receiving general education 80% or more of the time? Is that student receiving general education 40 to 79% of the time? Or is that student in regular classroom environment receiving general education 40% or less? This caught a few people in February. It may not be such a significant thing now. And because special education data coordinators are pretty good at submitting records ongoing, it may not be significant. However, if you're doing some accounting and you're submitting a lot of records to get updated, or if COVID has made it so that you can't have meetings and records weren't submitted until now, this is something to look forward to. And this helps explain the reason why it will show up when it previously has not. And then along with students who age during the school year, those students who turn 13 years, 9 months, most of these are going to be middle school students, possibly some freshmen. They're going to all of a sudden need transition services in IEP and transition service goals in IEP indicators selected. Again, this is just a yes or no value. It's very simple. It should be outlined in the IEP. This transition services are part of the IDEA. So all your special education coordinators would know about this. Anyone serving students with disability knows. But, you know, with COVID, being that records may not be submitted timely because of COVID, I don't know. This is something that if you get a submission error and it says transition services missing, you want to first verify the student's age. If they are at least 13 years and 9 months, it's going to be required. So you look at their birth date and CalPADS and then determine. And if they're not, if for whatever reason they haven't been established or set, you can indicate no, it's not part of the student's IEP. And so you have your special education services, right? You first submit your SPED records, and then you submit your service records. And the most important data element in the SSRV, or the service record, is just accounting and reporting that service that's being provided for the primary disability. And students can have more than one service, of course. And, you know, the service is just a coded value telling us, you know, what type of special education service is being provided. Then you have the service provider and the location, whether the student's reporting LEA is a, say, unified school district. However, the service provider could be the SELPA or it can be an NPS school, right? Then you have the location. Where is the student receiving these services, right? So you have who's providing the service and where are they at? Are they at a regional center? It might be at the county office, could be at the school. So those are two important elements in the SSRV, the service provider and location. And then, of course, the frequency and duration. The frequency is how often the service provided, 2, 3, 4 every day, 3 times a week, 2 times a week every day, and then how long each time, right? So say the students in special education, or if the students in general education, a regular classroom for 80% of the time, well, how long when they're receiving specific special education services, how long is that? Is that an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 3 hours, whatever it is? That's the duration, is how many times each session is being provided. And then very important with service records is the relationship to your special education program records. Many errors that we have, many cert errors, are related to associating a service with the proper special education program record. And so the records are tied together through the special education meeting or amendment code. And you would have to open up the student's record in CalPads. And there's videos on YouTube that demonstrate this for several different errors. You would use Control F, find the meeting that's in your error, you find the meeting ID, and then do a comparison between the SPED record. And inevitably, there will be one service record that doesn't have a special education meeting or what have you. It'd be tied to the wrong type of meeting. Again, triennial evaluation shouldn't have services. So if you have a meeting or amendment record, service record, and it has the matching meeting or amendment ID to a triennial, you'll receive an error. But it's very important, and we just wanted to highlight this field because it's when you're troubleshooting, there's several different videos that we show on YouTube how to use this meeting or amendment ID to pinpoint your error. So we just wanted to bring that up. We hadn't made much mention of it last year, and quite honestly, because we didn't realize the importance of it last year. It was the initial year. And so I'm gonna let Kyron do most of the talking about post-secondary. I like to call him the guru, not because he deserves it or I like to be complimentary of Kyron, but it alleviates me of any responsibility to knowing anything about the PSTS. So Kyron will talk about the resources used to determine who should be surveyed, what type of survey, the primary field in post-secondary for special education students, because there's so many fields that aren't associated. There's 2 fields or 3 new fields specific for CTE students. So we really just want to know their outcome. And so these are the survey answers, right? But I'll let Kyron take over here.
Okay, guys. So let me share my screen here. So part of end of year 4 submission is, of course, the submission of PSTS records for students, special education students who left the district last year and never came back. It's either because of school completion, as you can see here on the user manual documentation. So anyone who completed high school last year and never returned must be surveyed. And anyone who exited high school last year using these codes and never came back must also be surveyed. So if you go back to the CalPads Flash Communications, I believe that's Flash 203. Let's go back and let's go to the CalPads website and go to Flash 203. It does say there the different information we have for PSTS. If you guys haven't looked at this yet, this is the best time to do that. I could post it on the chat, or if someone could post it, that would be great. So it gives you all the fields related to end of year. So essentially, the PSTS was already collected last fall too, right? And this is for students who completed high school and completed CTE pathways, or yeah. And so Some may have been SPED students too, and so you send out a survey for them. Now here's end of year 4, and we also want you guys to send in another record. If you've surveyed them before, and you could probably survey them again, and just because they're special ed, because the survey for special ed is 12 months after they left school. And so if you're sending out surveys, you might as well send out another survey if there are any updates to those students, and then fill out this information. So for PSTS, you have here, you can submit more than one status of the student. If your SEDS vendor is capable of extracting multiple statuses, that's well and good. However, if they can only,